Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of 9/11 Freefall. I am the host, Andy Steele, and this is going to be an interesting one tonight. At least it is for me. We used to do a lot of shows like this in the past, back in the audio days, the early days of this show. We're going to be talking about the psychology of 9/11. And what does that mean? Well, if anybody out in this audience is a 9/11 truth advocate, which I would guess most of them are, you know that when you talk to people about the evidence of controlled demolition at the World Trade Center on September 11th or any other aspects of 9/11 that might be in question, you get a little bit of resistance out there. You get a little bit of cognitive dissonance. We hear that term a lot, probably a lot of other psychological functions going on, and this applies whenever anybody stands out from a crowd or talks about any kind of stigmatizing issue. Fascinating topic, psychology is, and of course it relates to what we do here at AE 9/11 Truth. So today we have Clark Rector on. Clark is a licensed psychologist who works with individuals, couples, and families. He was raised in Sonoma, Colorado. He spent 3 years in Montana and studied fish and wildlife biology, but changed his major to psychology after realizing people seem to need even more help than animals. Ain't that the truth? He now lives in Portland, Oregon, and we're going to be learning a lot more about him today. So, Clark, welcome to 9/11 Freefall.
Thanks, Andy. Thank you for the invitation today.
Well, thank you for joining us.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I have been to Colorado. It was beautiful, but I was actually born in California. And so, I grew up there.
That's what happens when I don't wear these right here. That's what happens when I... Sorry about that.
No problem.
That sounded right. All right. California, folks. Sonoma's in California, and I should know that because I live there. Go ahead.
Yeah, no problem. So, I was raised in California, and I did Boy Scouts, and I am an Eagle Scout. I believe in all points of the Scout law: trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind, obedient, cheerful, thrifty, brave, clean, and reverent. The one that I don't really agree with is the obedient one. And I got to learn a little bit more about that in grad school when I studied psychology, and we learned about the Milgram experiments. I learned that obedience was probably not a great thing. What else would you like to know about me?
Well, tell our audience what the Milgram experiment is. I'm somewhat familiar with it, but some people out there may not be, and that is a fascinating study that was done. Please go ahead.
Yeah. So the gist of the Milgram experiment was totally a faked up study, but the participants were not aware of that. So basically what you had is the participants were supposed to be teaching the learner some sort of task, and then the participant would correct them, if they got the answer right or wrong. And they were told by this kind of authoritarian person in a white lab coat that they were to deliver electric shocks to the student. And so the gist of it, and I forget all the numbers on it exactly, but an astonishing percentage of the participants delivered the full range of electric shocks to the student or the learner. I forget the term they used on it. And so the implications of that study, as you can imagine, are kind of disturbing. The implications are that when there is an authority figure present, that apparently most people, I think it was something around 70%, would deliver the full range of shocks. And again, this was all fake. Nobody was actually receiving shocks, but it was realistic enough that it seemed like they were delivering the shocks. So that's kind of the gist of the Milgram experiment.
Right. And I watched a video on this back, in college. Seems like a long time ago. And this was in a sociology class. And they show some of these people sitting at the switchboard type of thing, and they tell them, oh, there's a person in the other room who's getting these shocks if you push the button. And you can see the nervousness and hesitation on their faces and in their body language. And at some point, I mean, there was some guy saying, that guy, we're gonna kill that other person in there. But he would continue to go on and deliver the shots because somebody with an authoritative voice and probably dressed up, maybe in a white lab coat or some kind of fancy garb, is telling them to do this. And, this audience may say, I would never do anything like that. I would never shock a person, but it goes beyond the shocks. The shocks are just a symbol of authority. I mean, it could go into situations that have just happened in day-to-day life. A person's accused of something, and then all the forces kind of align against them. And those forces don't even bother to ask that person their perspective. Someone might need to stand up for them. So we run into these situations a lot throughout life, and it's a really good thing to look into, the Milgram experiment. Mm-hmm. Tell us more about yourself in relation to September 11th. Obviously, right. You're here and you understand that there's a problem with the official story. How did you start to look into this evidence and see 9/11 differently?
Yeah. So one of my first exposures to 9/11 truth was actually met Ted Walter at a wedding in Sonoma County. And so, here's this person chatting with me about the official story and the problems with it. And at that time, I knew nothing about it. And so at the time I was kind of probably feeling a little nervous, kind of inching backwards as I was listening, but I was still open-minded about it. And so that was one of my first exposures to truth, to 9/11 truth. Although, in fairness, my first exposure to the concept of truth and being lied to by the government actually went back even further than that. We had a family friend who did Morse code during the time of the attack on Pearl Harbor. And so he actually told us firsthand, that the United States knew about the attack. And even though it was of course, advertised to be a surprise attack, that was not the complete truth with it. Those were some of my earliest exposures to 9/11 truth. And then at one point I had a friend who kept asking me, what do you think about Building 7? And he would ask me this again and again. And at the time I didn't really know what to think about it because I didn't know that the deception was there. But eventually, in the year of 2017, I had just finished a dissertation called Shame and Stigma in Psychotherapy, or it was called, Shame and Stigma in Psychotherapy, a Quantitative Investigation. And so I had finished that dissertation, and I had just moved to Oregon as I was waiting to start my internship. So I had some time on my hands, and I spent 3 or 4 days looking into some really basic stuff around 9/11 truth, like the melting point of steel, and whether jet fuel can burn hot enough to destroy steel in the way that we saw in the video footage. And it only took about 3 or 4 days, and of course, building on other experiments and information that people had done already. But that really led to my awakening, just being able to look at that really basic information with my own eyes and ears. So that is kind of how I first awakened to 9/11.
Well, there you go. And by the way, you mentioned the melting point of steel. I just want to say to the audience here, I live in Arizona. We get 2 seconds of winter time. So if you see me wiping my head, it's because it's getting really warm around here lately. But it's so fascinating to look at 9/11 and the Great Deception and the cover-up from a sociological perspective. I really believe that once this gets exposed, we are going to have college classes in psychology and probably other aspects of academic study that are going to analyze this time in history. And 100 years from now, people are going to be fascinated with it, writing papers about it because of what took place. So you're obviously awake to the evidence of controlled demolition. You must pay attention, considering your profession, to how the society reacts to people who raise these questions. What's the most interesting thing you've picked up about how our establishment society reacts to information that gets presented that's counter to the official 9/11 narrative?
Yeah, could you rephrase that question one more time? The audio glitched out just for a moment.
Sure. What is the most interesting thing that you've picked up observing about our society and how it reacts to people that have a different view of 9/11 than the mainstream?
Got it. Thank you. Got it. All right. Yeah. So I think first about deception, which, as you know, I'm actually editing a book project on that, and so yeah, I think about how people have been quite literally deceived about 9/11 and a number of other geopolitical events, and I'm not sure what else to say about it. It's the kind of thing that you know, I think about how stigma and taboo tie in as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's pretty clear that people have some pretty negative opinions about so-called conspiracy theorists. That has been very, very clear to me. So, not sure what to say with it beyond that.
Well, let me give you a good example here. Now, you may not have seen this confrontation, but there was one several years ago. And Jesse Ventura, who, yes, he was a professional wrestler at one point, but he was also governor of Minnesota, and he kind of knows his stuff pretty well about, world events, goes on some Fox morning show. It might have been the Fox and Friends or whatever they called it. And anyway, the subject of 9/11 comes up. Of course, he questions the official story of 9/11. Starts off as a sort of regular discussion, but obviously Fox News exists to try to attack people who hold that view. And when Jesse Ventura doesn't back down, it leads to this big fight between him and one of the hosts. I can't remember the guy's name. He was a young guy. And what's interesting about this, first of all, you see Jesse Ventura gets into sort of this posture like he wants to control himself from leaping out of his chair at this guy. But the other guy just sort of loses this veneer of mainstream media, pomp and circumstance, phoniness that you usually see, and becomes very human. And at one point in the conversation, Ventura, this leads into a discussion of the war on terror, and Ventura says, when is it over? And this news host guy is yelling, when they're dead, when they're all dead. I mean, you can tell this has gone completely off script. The other hosts look very nervous. And the Fox News host that was arguing with Ventura storms off the set. So you can tell this is not just a scripted attack on Jesse Ventura planned out ahead of time. This guy was really angry. So, you're going off of this based on my description, and you may not have watched it, but just from that description, what is going on here in the Fox News host, who basically it's just his job. He doesn't have to agree with Ventura, but it's just his job to interview him, but he gets so triggered by this.
Yeah. Some of the things thank you, Andy, that kind of helped me get my brain into gear a little bit better. So some of the things that I think about here are trauma. An explosive anger reaction. An explosive anger reaction is a really classic trauma response in what we call today post-traumatic stress disorder. And so I think about that. I think about fear. I think about enmity, the process of creating enemies. Which is something, as far as I know, that happens around just about any kind of war. I'm not a historian. It makes sense to me that we see these explosive reactions. But I think that explosive reactions like that are just one of the phenomena related to trauma. The one that I probably see the most often is actually just silence, just a blankness. Like, for example, if I'm maybe sharing a counter narrative view or a so-called conspiracy theory type idea with a friend, maybe I am having a text conversation or an in-person conversation or a phone conversation. In any case, the thing that I probably see the most is the person will just kind of go blank or maybe change the subject, perhaps as a way of just avoiding any kind of feelings of terror around it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'll tell you another quick story. So there's these videos people used to do a couple of years ago on YouTube. And I do not recommend doing this, folks. Please don't do this to people because it's an incredibly mean thing to do. But, it's sort of like, it's out there. So I'm going to watch it as a study. And it's where you can do this with your phone and with the TV somehow, with YouTube. You can put on an EAS alert, a warning about incoming nuclear missiles, and interrupt the TV with that and make everybody in the house think that this is happening. So people do this as pranks to their family and friends. And so this guy does this to his wife, and he's got a hidden camera, and she's all alone. And they got the baby in the high chair eating its food. She's doing the dishes. The alert comes on when the guy pushes the button. And the first thing she does is she watches it for a second, and she turns the TV off and goes back to watching dishes. And I said, you know what? That is an incredibly interesting reaction. And I'm not saying everybody reacts that way. A lot of people start screaming and stuff. That's why you don't do this to your friends. But she turns off the TV and just nervously goes back to washing dishes. And I said, that is fascinating. I'm going to bring that up on the show someday. So how does that relate to what you were just talking about?
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's kind of this psychological black box that happens inside of people, especially when we're talking about 9/11 and COVID and assassinations and all these things that are just cloaked with taboo, this kind of taboo energy. It's not too surprising to me that we would see a variety of different responses. I think that in order to really wrap one's mind around, say, 9/11, I think that there will certainly be a lot of really heavy roadblocks in the way. I think that a person would need to really rearrange their worldview in order to even consider the possibility that those three buildings, World Trade Center 1, 2, and 7, were brought down via what appears to be controlled demolition. And so I think that the mere implications of that can be extremely uncomfortable for people to even, they may not even know how to go about even beginning to square that in their minds. And to even go about the process of how even the possibility of controlled demolition squares with all of the many messages that they were told, i.e. that we had two planes that brought down two buildings. That's my basic comment there. A lot of roadblocks. And I think it also taps into attachment psychology as well. I think that it taps into some really deep questions around security. And can I even feel safe living in this country anymore, or living in the world anymore, or whatever? So I think that the process of awakening to 9/11 really necessarily involves some really profound shuffling around of all these different beliefs.
Yeah, and I have people who have just relied on television. This sounds like something that's out of left field for them when they first hear this. So no doubt it brings up a lot of different emotions. I want to talk about your paper that I looked at today. It's called Shame and Stigma in Psychotherapy. And what's interesting is, the fact that shame is more of an internal process, stigma comes from society. That's my basic interpretation. But there's some very fascinating themes in this paper. Please talk about shame and stigma and also how it relates to the 9/11 issue.
Yeah, for sure. So in this paper, I was basically, what I basically did was to give the participants, I think I had about 283, oh gosh, I shouldn't guess, but something around there, participants. And I gave them a shame measure and a stigma measure. And my goal here was to try to see how closely related those were. But, to be honest, the part that was the most interesting to me was in hearing people's responses about their shameful experiences in psychotherapy. And I was actually quite surprised to learn how common that is for people to have had experienced overly shaming experiences in therapy. Okay, so you're also asking what does this have to do with 9/11?
Yeah, I mean, apply some of these concepts of shame and stigma, and how does this used in society and apply to people, for instance, who question 9/11, sort of keep them in line and keep them from questioning this event?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that both shame and stigma are related to social processes. I'm not sure, for example, if shame would really exist if we didn't live in community with other people. And same for stigma as well. So yeah, I would just start out by saying that there are some really powerful forces around both of these things, shame and stigma. Like if a person is going out of line in some way, then that is very likely. It's almost guaranteed to elicit a shame response. And there's actually neuropsychological patterns associated with that. I'm sure you've seen it before, where the tonus in the neck muscle changes, and the eye contact might be averted. The person might feel like hiding. So, yeah, these things are completely related to studying 9/11 and studying the alternative evidence, we could say.
It's fascinating to look at people's body language when you talk to them about this. And I'm not talking about if I talk to you or I talk to some other person in the truth moment. I'm just talking about, the regular people out there. I was on a date once, and it was the first date. And anyway, the topic of what do I do comes up. And I work here, so I can't just kind of brush this off as a hobby or something. It's like, your job takes up most of your day. So I explained it. I didn't want to talk about it all night. And the minute it came out of my mouth with some explanation, I could see the girl goes from open body language and her arms just immediately cross while I'm talking.
Right.
And I said, okay, well, this is going to be over in probably 20 minutes, but whatever, you got to get it out in the beginning, right? But you see this all of the time. The eyes get big, the eyes look away, the arms cross. People have this kind of a reaction, and maybe, I don't know, 20 years ago, I would have, but I'm so out of touch with that person from long ago. I'm the guy who talks about this every day now. So I just don't get it. I don't get why people take this event, which was really horrible, obviously, which they watched on television and personalize it so, because if when it comes out that this was a controlled demolition inside job, maybe some people are going to go to jail, but it's not going to be that girl. It's not going to be the person down the street. It's going to be those people. It's not like they're related to them. So I don't get it. Why is there such a personal association sort of with keeping this covered up and not being able to consider an alternative explanation for what went on? It's truly fascinating to me.
Yeah, I agree, Andy. It's fascinating to me as well. I like to think that I'm a very open-minded and curious person, but my general impression is that there has been, it appears to me that there's been psychological conditioning that has been used on a very mass level in a fashion that leads us to not ask questions in the first place. I think Craig McKee wrote a couple pieces about this at least on the AE website. He spoke about the door seeming like it's closed. Do not pass this point. Ask no further questions, kind of thing. And so, just in my day-to-day life, that's something that I see. In conversations with my friends and family, or in conversations on social media, people seem to have lost curiosity, or people seem to maybe be too afraid to bring up certain things or to ask certain questions. And so, if that's true, if people really do feel too scared to ask questions, then they're not going to get very much information. And so, that's some of my thoughts on that.
Well, yeah, and the thing is, where I'm at right now, even if it's something I think is absolutely crazy, I'll still sit back and say, why do you believe that crazy thing? Convince me, right? And it's just the general public does not seem to want to do that. Now, I can remember being in college. There was a guy, he was missing one leg. I don't know why or what the circumstances behind that was, but I was working at the library. He worked at the library. And I was making a comment about how I didn't like the videos that played in the dining hall. I thought they were too patronizing to the students, that they were just focused, showed a bunch of people jumping in Jell-O or a pool full of it or whatever and partying and stuff. And I thought, is this really representative of the people that go to the school or whatever? And he makes this comment he says, well, they want to keep you occupied with, foolish party behavior because we're in the age group where revolutions happen and they want to keep a revolution from starting. And I remember I gave a glance to the guy next to me and we were like, oh, those are really big words and a really weird thinking, talking about revolution. This guy is nuts. We had that immediate knee-jerk reaction, but I would, if he was around, I'd probably interview him now to get his thoughts on things because he sounds like he was ahead of the time, certainly ahead of me. So I guess we're all guilty of that at some point. You have a term here that you shared in our emails.
Yeah.
It's called deception-informed practitioners. This is key and very important, but talk about that term in the context of your profession.
Yeah, thanks, Andy, for giving me the chance to talk about that. So this is basically a concept that that's been formed by other psychological ideas, but it's basically a concept that I'm developing. And the basic idea of it is to help practitioners remain compassionate with their clients, regardless of whatever president they voted for. I'll occasionally hear stories about a therapist fired their client because of who the client voted for, and that's certainly not something that I would ever do myself. To fire a client based on their beliefs. So that's kind of the gist of it. And if you'd like, I could kind of read through some of these ideas, or allow you to kind of flesh it out a little bit more.
I would absolutely. I just want to say I would love to have, during the election, go to a therapist wearing a Kamala hat and a Trump T-shirt and just have them try to figure that out. Say, doctor, I don't know who I am. Please talk about the concepts behind this.
Yeah, that would get some good cognitive dissonance going for sure. Yeah. So let me read some of my ideas here if I can find it. Okay. So I propose that psychotherapists and other clinicians who are deception-informed practice the following. Deception-informed practitioners are aware of and open-minded to mass deception events being real and affecting huge numbers of people. Examples are many, but broadly include cover-up operations, state crimes against democracy, and deep state events. So the basic idea here is that we would hope that the therapist would have at least some foggy notion that something was amiss with the JFK assassination or with COVID, or that something was amiss with 9/11. And so let me go on to the next one. Deception-informed practitioners remain open-minded to worldviews that differ radically from their own. For example, a therapist who has a client who mentions in session they twice voted for a president that therapist happens to detest. Yet, the therapist remains open to the client's viewpoints and reasoning. The therapist may, for example, consider that the client likely has many reasons as to why they voted that way. And so you can kind of get the gist of where I'm going with this, but I'll kind of pause there and give you a chance to ask any questions.
Well, I think this is incredibly important, and I've thought about this for people out there who may have some kind of issue that has nothing to do with their 9/11 beliefs, their 9/11 activism, and they may be upset by the fact that 9/11 was an inside job, but there's also something else going on there. Maybe they were a victim of abuse when they were younger or whatever, but it kind of gets all together as a mishmash of neuroses for them, and they want to talk about this, and so they go to the therapist, and they're talking about their childhood, but they're also mentioned about how they went to their 9/11 truth meeting, the tap talk that week or whatever. And when it comes to, oh, what's that? The guy explains. And now the therapist is on this idea that the person is suffering from psychosis or delusions or something. This is all getting worked in when really that the person isn't. This is what they believe based on evidence that they've seen. And so that's got to be a very stressful thing for somebody that needs to go to therapy, because they're concerned that the therapist is going to start diagnosing them with things that are unfairly diagnosed based off of what they think about these events.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I think it's completely feasible that a client could start, talking about certain things, whether it's related to 9/11 or the moon landing or whatever it was. And if the therapist is not informed about those events, or doesn't have at least the knowledge that those are contested events, then I think it seems feasible to me that they could start thinking, oh, maybe this client has OCD, or maybe they have a psychotic disorder, or something else going on. When the reality is just that this person has different beliefs that just don't square with what the mainstream media and government has told us.
That's a problem. And do they address this in the training for psychotherapists, that, somebody's beliefs about, whatever, whether it be 9/11, JFK, the moon landing, whatever topic, does, to separate an actual diagnosis for a psychosis, and I might be using terms wrong because I'm not trained in this stuff, but for some kind of neurosis or psychosis, to separate those factors from what they believe about world events.
Yeah, and I think we're on the same page here with this, I could just repeat what I've said already, which is that at very least we would hope, and I think that most therapists are, at very least we could hope that therapist could be open to the possibility that what they've been told about 9/11 is not correct. And so, if you want, I could kind of read a little bit more from here, or whatever you think. So, all right. Let me see here. Deception-informed practitioners are able to recognize abusive behaviors, whether observed in a single person or as part of a mass deception. So, as you know, I'm editing this book on mass deception, which is it's not an easy book. I'm still trying to wrap my own head around it. But one of the things that I intend for the book to do is to kind of look at some of the parallels between, so-called domestic violence that might happen between, say, two people, or in a given household, and the violence that might happen on a much larger scale. And so, any comments there?
Well, I always boiled things down to personal situations. I love making comparisons, metaphors, allegories, whatever you call them, comparing one thing to another, because, man, things that happen on a national scale can also be compared against things that happen within a person's life. Each person is sort of like a little country with a parliament. Everyone's like wearing powdered wigs in their head and looks just like them. But there's so many comparisons. And, it's like let's say you have a family where there is sexual abuse going on. Mm-hmm. The family has no problem making fun of dad's drinking problem, for instance, the fact that he's stumbling around at block parties, walked into the fence again that night, but they're not going to talk about the sexual abuse stuff. And that's what I always said when people would say, oh, but they talk about conspiracies on TV and there's shows all about them and this stuff. It's like, yeah, there's certain things that are pretty safe to talk about and certain things you're allowed to criticize the government for, like dad's drinking problems. But what you're not going to talk about is the real hardcore stuff. The fact that 2 planes can't knock down 3 buildings on that day. So there's some comparisons there. I'm kind of curious about your comparisons to the national situation with 9/11 and what an individual goes through, situations that they may, that it's very similar to.
Yeah, such a great question. I'm still, very much like trying to wrap my head around that and even understand it, which is a little ironic given that I'm editing a book on the topic. But I do see parallels there between whether the violence is happening in a given bedroom or on a much broader scale. In either case, it can wreak a lot of havoc. And so let's see here. Shall I read one more part from this?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Deception-informed practitioners are compassionate towards those whose political beliefs, worldview, or ideas about climate change or political party differ from what is most common in that community. For example, for clients seeking care at a student psychotherapy clinic in Berkeley, California, a client who identifies as Republican shall be as warmly welcomed as a client who identifies as a Democrat.
Yeah.
So, I hope that we can do this. I think that this is something that I think this is something that our field is struggling with, and surely I'll occasionally have clients who might come to me, consulting about a case maybe, or maybe venting about it's really challenging. Like my clients' beliefs are challenging to me. The gist of it. So.
Well, but this is kind of a new phenomenon on the big scheme of the world, or the big, timeline, because when I was a kid growing up in the 80s, one of the first elections that I remember, paid attention to, was Bush and Dukakis. I didn't know a thing about either of them, what their policies were. I just knew that my father liked Dukakis, my mom liked Bush, and it didn't ever cause any problems or anything. Everybody just, had their opinions and moved on. People had opinions about this, but, marriages didn't break up over it. Right. Society wasn't fighting each other that passionate about Bush or Dukakis. And so even when it was Bush and Gore and there was a little bit of protest because of the election, I was in college at that time, everybody chilled out. I had a teacher say, either way, the sun still rises in the morning. And I'm not saying there aren't consequences to these elections, but now the media puts it in everybody's heads, right or left, that the consequences of this are going to be the end of the American Republic as we know it. The world is going to end tomorrow, and put out very biased views of each, their opposing candidate's position. And now people suddenly are like, we're in the religious wars of medieval times again.
Yeah.
They're just
Yeah.
ready to go die for this almost. So I guess, how much of a role does the media have in egging this on?
Yeah, I would suspect. Don't quote me, but I would suspect that the media has a huge part about this, and I think back to the process of enmity as well. So, for example, statements that Biden made about the anti-vaxxers being the enemy, or the unvaccinated being the enemy, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be one example of enmity, of creating enmity to be used for some purpose. Similarly, we obviously had loads of enmity happening around 9/11 as well, and it was kind of pounded into our heads to believe that that radical Muslims were the criminals in the first place, and are bad. And so, yeah, it's undoubtedly true in my mind that some really heavy propaganda campaigns have been used. Not just in recent decades, but probably goes way back to Western expansion. Considering Native Americans to be savages and hostile and so on. I think that too, fits right in to enmity and making war. Once a person or a group of people is regarded as being subhuman, then they're just an abstraction, and you can basically do anything to them. And that right there, in my opinion, is kind of the heart of war making.
I'd love to get your view on this, and this kind of relates to 9/11 in that when I started down this path of 9/11 truth years ago, it just seemed like the knee-jerk position to have that we should have as much information as possible. We should be consuming as much as possible. We should all be paying attention. We should all be speaking out about everything, gaining everyone's point of view. Now I'm 46, in 2025, and everybody is wired into every single thing that is taking place. Everybody's got an opinion on that. Everybody's got a blog and a video channel or a video blog or whatever. They don't write that much anymore. But they all have a podcast about something, and they're all spouting off about this or that. Everybody feels the need to pick a side, baked potato or mashed. You got to take a position on this. And
Right.
so, and we're all so tuned in that we know everything that's going on practically the second that it happens, and we're registering our opinions. I'm going to share my opinion. I don't think it's going to bias you or anything, but I just, I don't think this is healthy for society. I don't think that we should be this wired into the hive. And I probably can't explain my thesis in a very scholarly way because I don't have the training, but I just don't think it's healthy for people to be this wired in. Those are my thoughts, but I'd like to hear you address that problem I bring up.
Yeah. So one thing I think about here, Andy, is just like tolerance for differing viewpoints. I forget the statistics on it, but my understanding is that there was one study that looked at how well people tolerate when one family member marries into a family that tends to identify with the so-called opposite political party. And the gist of the study, and I'm sorry I don't remember the numbers, but the tolerance for being able, the tolerance for that has gone down quite a lot just in recent decades. And so, it's kind of alarming to me. Also, I think a lot about the influence of artificial technology. For example, I asked Meta's little free AI that comes with Facebook. I asked it to summarize the Holsey paper, University of Alaska Fairbanks paper.
Mm-hmm.
So I asked it to provide a summary, and I will disclose that I have not read that paper cover to cover. So that's an important thing that I point out. But one thing that I noticed in that artificial intelligence summary was it appeared that the AI was injecting, as part of the summary, information that was in line with the official story and that did not seem likely to have come from the Halsey paper. So that was like a kind of jaw-dropping moment for me, because it became so apparent, oh my gosh, you can engineer all this stuff. So that's one thing that I think about a lot, is the social engineering involved in the use of AI and in social media in general.
Yeah, well, they use the social media to sort of control people. You know, when we first got started in 9/11 Truth, it was MySpace, and we used it to spread information. And so you had these blobs, I don't like to use that word, but these blobs of 9/11 truthers and groups kind of coming together, and it happened exponentially. But then, you know, somewhere around 2010 or 2012, Facebook came in and sort of changed things and started limiting what you could do, and they kind of got their control of it. So now that when you go on Facebook, you get a bunch of stuff that's designed towards you, right? And it keeps you in this little echo chamber.
Exactly.
And you feel like you're, you know, oh my God, everybody must like all the same stuff that I do, because, or believe the same way that I do, because look at all these posts coming up from all these sources. But somebody who's on the opposite side of the fence is getting all their stuff in the same fashion as well. And so it's not good. And also, I think we're having some very human consequences because of all of this. I just started reading Bowling Alone, which is about the loss of human connection in the United States because of technology, starting with television. But you're seeing it now. And with AI, it's going to be worse. It's sitting there granting dreams to people like a genie, doing all of this stuff for them, taking necessary struggle out of human existence. And this is going to have a psychological effect on our people as well. And then I think it's going to make it harder to get to the truth of 9/11. What do you think?
I think, yes, I think it certainly can. I think I have no doubt that AI can be used in nefarious ways that will continue to keep truths under wraps. However, I believe, actually, you did on one of your podcast episodes with the fellow who wrote Google. So Zach Voorhees, if I'm pronouncing his name right. So Zach spoke about using it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but in your interview with him, he touched on using AI to uncover untruths in official documents. Is that right?
He talked a little bit about that, because the concerns that you're citing are same concerns that I have. It's all going to be based on who programs the AI. He's saying that it's become, if I remember correctly, he was saying that it's becoming so in the hands of the grassroots that there's going to be competing AIs, and that they could be used as a tool to get information out.
Yeah. Well, I believe it. I mean, every time I try to do some navigation in my car, I guarantee Apple Maps and Google Maps are at war trying to get in there. So I completely believe the concept of these warring AIs. That makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah, it's important to spend time in the real world too, because I think we're doing less and less of that lately. I want to know, because, you know, if you're somebody that takes an unpopular view on things, but you know you're right, or you think there's enough evidence to stand by your position, and the rest of society is stigmatizing you for it, that's got to have a toll on you.
Yeah.
And also, too, it becomes harder to trust things. You know, some people go down such rabbit holes they don't trust anything anymore. Now, I'm not one of those people, but you know, I trust some things. I don't believe everything is some kind of inside job, but I look at things skeptically. But you know, it completely throws you off balance waking up to this information. How do you find balance in your life when somebody?
I think so. sorry to butt in. It's so interesting.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree. I think that it's certainly temporarily coming to terms with truth stuff can definitely knock a person off balance. However, and yes, it can require a lot of guts and courage to like put your ideas out there, you know, whether you're on that first date or whatever situation, or on a podcast with thousands of listeners or whatever, whatever it is. It takes guts and courage to put that out there for sure. But I think that in the long term, I think that coming out, to be totally honest, I kind of think of my own journey as kind of a coming out experience, in quite similarly to the way that a person might come out as being not heterosexual. Um, I have definitely been met with some really heavy resistance in my circles, no doubt about it. And anyway, the point that I'm getting to here is that ultimately my own coming out process has been liberating. It has helped me tap into my own creativity. It has helped me kind of be who I am. And so I think that it can certainly be very destabilizing at first, but in the long run, can lead to a real sense of liberation as well.
That's right. Never lack the courage to be who you really are out there. I mean, my mom used to say something to me when I was growing up. You worry about, the people at school say this, or the people out in society say this, or at the job or whatever. And it's like, who are the people that really matter in your life? Is it really, that out there, that yuck, or is it just, this core group of people? So I say this to the audience, make sure you know who your real friends are, worry about them, and don't worry about the rest, because it's just, it's just all just NPCs kind of moving about or whatever. And none of it matters. None of it matters what they're saying about you out there, as long as you are safe and happy in your own four walls at the end of the day. None of it makes a difference.
Yeah. And I would just add, tag on to that even if or when things go sideways with family or friends, I've certainly experienced this. Even just a couple days ago, I was debating on a truth related topic with a Facebook friend, a good friend of mine, and after that, I just sent him some friendly text messages, and we were able to reconnect really quite easily. And so I think that can really go a long way. I think that just contact and reconnection are really like antidotes for shame and stigma. So for any truthers out there who are fighting the good fight, so to speak, I just encourage you to come back around the barn and reconnect with people, even when things get really heated.
Exactly. And the thing is, you don't want to burn your bridges either over it. Just because your best friend since you were fifth grade or whatever now disagrees with you about 9/11, it's not something to end the whole friendship over. They'll realize they were wrong later when AE gets this exposed. So don't worry about it. Just, talk about other things, and, there's other good qualities about them, and we can't demonize our enemies either. I did my own share of that in the beginning, and, I just don't do that anymore. It's not productive, and everybody's a person. We're all dealing with our own challenges, so we try to be tolerant and just try to move on and accept. Clark, any final thoughts before we close out the show today?
Yeah, I just really appreciate the forum that you provided here for me today, and for all your guests that you've had. You've had some very, very smart people on this show. Much smarter and more scholarly than myself. And as far as I know, you've been interviewing people about 9/11 for perhaps longer than anyone else. And so I just appreciate you keeping that going and providing some space to discuss these really super taboo topics. I think that is a wonderful thing, a useful thing, and can really help people grow, can help societies grow. So I appreciate your dedication.
Well, thank you. And no, you've been a great guest. Very interesting. We are going to have you back, and good luck to you in your projects.
Thank you, Andy.
Hit that notification bell and slam the like button and subscribe. Thanks.